Hi, I'm Angus at LabVac, and today I have an Agilent Technologies DS202 vacuum pump. Probably, well, certainly to me, more commonly known as a Varian DS202. Varian's like the vacuum division owned by Agilent, so I'd call this a Varian pump. But maybe you don't. It's a rare thing to see. I'm in the UK. We really don't see many of these pumps as a standalone. They're usually attached to a piece of equipment and would be serviced and or replaced under the service contract on the piece of kit. So it's unusual to see one standalone turn up on the bench like this. As such, there might be a bit of a learning curve going on because it is years since I've seen one of these. Basic process, same as all the pumps we do. I've drained the oil, got rid of the oil already. First thing I want to do is take these two side flashes off with a tiny little Allen key. With very small hardware like this, you have to be careful, particularly when it's been rammed on quite as tight as this has. It's easy to strip these things out, and it's also easy to lose them. So we try not to do either of those two things today. So, one side panel. Forgive my big fat head getting in the way of the camera. There we go. It's a 2.5 millimeter Allen key I'm using to do that. So with those out of the way, I'm going to tip the pump up on end. Have drained it. Sometimes you get a little bit of residual oil coming out of there. And then I can take there's two machine screws in there holding the base plate on. That's the base plate done. Next thing to do is remove the motor, and we have 3 bolts for the motor in a slightly unusual departure from tradition, which would be to have 4 bolts, one on each corner. So that's the easy two. Now the third one is possible for you to see. It's up here underneath the terminal box. It's got this huge terminal box. God only knows what's going on inside there. Let's hope the motor works and I don't have to find out. But in the centre there is our third bolt, very inconveniently positioned. Means I can't get into the end of it and spin it out the way I'd normally like to do. It's too tight to do by fingers. So I've got to work it half a turn at a time, like that. It's little things like this that Just didn't need to be so difficult, you know. If that could have been perhaps done differently at the design stage, it would make the life of service engineers so much easier. I used to work for a large firm who manufactured vacuum pumps, and at every management meeting I would argue that the design engineers should spend one day a month working in the service department so that they would see and understand the issues that they create by the choices that they make at the design stage. Obviously everyone completely ignored me and that never happened, but here we go. So that's the 3 bolts taken out of there. With a bit of luck, the motor will lift straight off, which is lovely. So up there you can see we've got a coupling and fan assembly. Sounds like there's a little bit of noise there. And a handle sits there. I'll take that away, I'll run it off camera and I'll see whether that noise is a problem. If it is, might have to get a bit more intimate with that motor. So what we can now see from the inside, we've got a felt pad, which in this case looks like it's fairly dry. The felt pad is there just to soak up the oil that leaks out of the pump. I would prefer that you knew when there was an oil leak and you got your pump serviced. That's the rubber coupling that sits between the motor and the pump, and that all feels a bit grimy. We might have a bit of fun on our hands here. So the next thing is to take the pump mechanism out of the oil box. On this pump and some others, the screws here actually go through and hold the oil box on. We often see them mounted the other way round, but this is what we've got. So we can release those. Take those 4 out. And then we can battle with releasing the pump from the oil box. Usual way to tackle this. This is a dead blow mallet but rubber coated so that it doesn't leave marks. That's just the inlet strainer. It's fallen out of the inlet there. So we'll just give that a few taps. And that just encourages the gasket to give up fighting and let us inside the pump. So there's our oil box, which does still have some oil in it. Also has quite a lot of nasty residue in there. Hopefully you can see that. So that's going to take a fair bit of cleaning. And then I'm loath to tip this up the other way, but the sight glass on the back end here is a removable, which I do like. Pumps with removable oil sight glasses are a great help. It means you can get in, clean things much more easily. Trying to clean the fixed ones are much more difficult process, and in some cases just not really achievable. So those screws out of there, and then the cover will come off. Underneath the cover, I'm just going to grab another pot to put these screws in. Just because if I put them all in one pot, I've then got to figure out which one's for what. So that's the sight glass cover removed. So the sight glass itself is going to now pop out of there. Does look tight. I'm going to need to tip this up so I can properly see what's going on. There we go. Okay. Can't immediately see that any space has been given to get in and lift that. So it's going to have to just be worked backwards and forwards. There we go. And then it does come away. So underneath there'll be an O-ring. This pump's very stuck. And there we go. That's the O-ring out of the way. That's the sight glass. That'll go through the ultrasonic and get thoroughly cleaned up. And then everything else that's on here, like the drain plug here, all these components can come out. There's slugs of muck everywhere, and there's a rubber gasket underneath there that stops that from leaking, so that needs to come out. And then likewise on the top here, we need a pin spanner to take that off. This is our oil filler, which appears that it has a bit of a relief valve built into that as well. So actually the exhaust port doesn't necessarily need to come off. I'll check with the kit as to exactly what's been provided when this goes back together. But that is a very filthy oil box. Look at all of this that's fallen out. I think it would be advisory to put some gloves on at this point, don't you? Before we move on, generally with pumps that come in, customers are pretty good at decontaminating before they arrive. So I don't tend to wear gloves because they are a little bit restrictive, but given what I've just seen, not messing about with this one. So back on here, top of our adapter plate, we've got a clamp plate holding the inlet and the gas ballast onto the adapter. Seems to have rather more screws than strictly necessary, I think. I've seen a lot of pumps where 2 screws up here would do. Take those off, that's 1/2 of the clamp. That's the other half, that's our inlet port. It can come off there, and again is O-ring sealed. Underneath there we've got our anti-suck back valve mechanism, And then the gas ballast is a screw type, comes all the way out of there. There's an O-ring for that, which I'll just pick out of there. And then there is a restrictor. I don't know how easy that is for you to see, but down inside there, there is a restrictor. You can see there's an orifice down in there. And that is threaded. It's threaded into there. So what you would need to do if you need to take that out is put a screwdriver down in there and unscrew that all the way out. What I will do when the pump is apart is spray some solvent down through the hole, make sure it comes through, in which case the restrictor is fine, it's not clogged up. So that should be sufficient, so we'll come back to that if we need to. Not entirely sure how the anti-suckback device is arranged here, so I'm just going to gently lift on that. It's a popping pad, and then we have a piston which is secured. So I can see the mechanism there. More than likely has a screw in from this side, but that won't lift out without releasing that. And there's a spring underneath that. So can't get any further with that just now. Let's move on to the body of the pump. Having said that, what I do want to do is come back to this coupling. Just take that coupling off before I go any further. Because I'm not going to be able to get the rotor out of the adapter plate without removing that. If you do get something like this, this is at a funny angle and there's no access hole, so I've got a ball end Allen key which allows me to go in at an angle. But it does mean I'm trying to turn the short end, so I'm just going to use a pair of grips on the short end of that to give it a bit more torque. It did release, so either it released the screw or the ball just fell off the end of the Allen key. So let's see which one it was. Right, I think we're good. And then that coupling will come off there. Underneath the coupling is held on by a key, so we don't want to lose that. And then you can see the outer shaft seal is here. But that means now that when I take the pump apart, that will be able to come through the adapter plate without fouling up. So we come to the pump itself, where we have a big old cover plate right the way over the top. I want to take that off there. It strikes me there's a lot to clean with these Varian pumps. And this one does feel like it's fairly gunged up. There we go, that's the two screws out of there. Let's start another pot. Just move it away from the drain holes in the bench. So then that cover can come off there. And here we can see what's going on with this anti-suckback valve. That's a mechanism and a half. So we've got a plunger here, which is oil driven. When the oil is circulating through the pump, there'll be oil pressure underneath that plunger. That rises up from the pressure of the oil, which in turn lifts this crank, which pushes down or at least releases the pressure holding the inlet valve, when the pump stops and the oil pressure drops because it's not circulating anymore, that crank drops down, and as you can see, causes the inlet valve to be forced shut. So it's a quite an elaborate mechanism there, all of which needs to come off. So we've got a second plate here which is holding the valves underneath. One of the screws through the cover went through here and was holding one end of that bar. So I just need now to release the other end of it. It is under spring pressure. So I'm going to hold on to that. Put that in there. And then that's the bar that holds the springs in place with the valve pads underneath them. Quite conventional, that little bit of the design. So that can come out. One of those didn't come. So we'll just get that one out of there. Keep those together. I haven't looked at the kit yet, but I'm presuming everything there will get replaced. If I haven't said it already, my advice with stripping down pumps is to keep every single part, every O-ring, every gasket. Hang on to everything until your pump is reassembled, because sometimes with the kits, particularly for old pumps, something that you expected to be in the kit suddenly isn't there. You may need to reuse a spring or whatever. It's not ideal, but it's better than having thrown everything away and not being able to reassemble the pump at all. So hang on to everything until you're certain that you don't need it. Okay, so the main pump mechanism is held into the adapter plate by 4 threaded rods which run right the way through and have these nuts on the other end. So the next thing to do is take those off, and hopefully we'll be able to take the whole pump mechanism out in one piece and have a look at that. I'm guessing at sizes 10mm spanner on those. What often happens is that the nut on here sticks to the rod, and the rod unthreads all the way through from the adapter plate, which is not a problem. It just means that it sometimes doesn't behave quite the way you're expecting it to. So there's a washer under each of those. I can feel that coming loose already. Just going to tip it that way and let gravity hold the two together while I get the hardware off. Okay, this one has unscrewed all the way through. They've got to come out anyway, so it really doesn't make any difference. But it's just good to be able to feel that while it's happening and know what's going on. So we should now be able to take the whole of the pump mechanism off in one piece. Like that. It was threatening to fall apart just then, but it managed to come off. Then we can get the rest of these rods out. And then you can see on this one here that the spring that's holding that mechanism is actually held by the rod to stop it from spinning all the way round. And that rod is very tight. Let's just get a little bit of solvent down there, see if it will release the threads. And otherwise we'll have to use a tool. And we've got a cork gasket that seals the oil box. is well and truly stuck on there. When you do have to remove these and they're stuck like this, this is a Stanley knife blade. I don't know, maybe it has a different name in other places, but here in the UK we call that a Stanley knife blade. What you want to try and do is to slide the blade underneath the cork and release it. And you need to do it carefully because you don't want to leave any scratches in the metal surface, because if that gets scratched up it becomes much more difficult to get a good seal on the new gasket when it goes back together. So caution with that. I'll do it off camera, but that's the general technique that I would use there. And that's all going to get cleaned up. This mechanism, it's a wonderful mechanism. It's already come apart in here. So see where that's popped out, because it would normally sit down on here. It's now turning too far around and popping off the valve. So that's going to be an interesting point when we come back to reassembly. But for the most part, that is the items off there, other than the shaft seal, which needs to get popped out. Hopefully that will come out fairly easily, so we'll give that a go just to show you how to go about that. So the shaft seal needs to come out in this direction. This is it from the inside. So I'm just going to put this is a D-sharpened screwdriver. Just going to seat it in there into the seal and give it a few taps in the hopes that it will come free. Nope, that just went straight through it. It can happen. Next option is to go for a seal driver. I'm sure some of you are saying, why wasn't that your first option? Well, maybe it should have been. We're working on the wrong side of the seal, really. It may be possible to drive it all the way through, which I'll try in a moment if this doesn't work. That's really in there. That's deforming the seal beautifully, but not actually causing it to move in any way. I can't put it the other way around because of that big mechanism. I could take all of that off. You have to revisit that, but basically that oil seal has got to come out of there. It might be easier to drive it all the way through. No, it won't, because it does actually have a seat on this side. So it's got to go out in that direction. There's the plunger that's just dropped out of there. So I might need to move that onto a different area of bench to free that. Let's move on to look at the pump mechanism itself. Clear a few tools out of the way. So this is our oil plunger that operates that anti-suck back valve mechanism. That literally just sits down in there. Oil pressure will come up under here. Push up on that. It looks very much like a hydraulic tap it out of a car kind of arrangement, but in reverse. So we've got an end plate here which has these button head Allen key screws in it, and they're the tiny size that we started off with again, and they're button heads. So So we have even more chance of this hardware failing on us. That's one. Two. Three. I take it back, they came out beautifully, no problem at all. That's the end plate. Underneath that end plate we have a gear drive oil pump. So the two interconnected cogs providing us with the oil pump to build pressure in there. And then the rest of these sections are going to come apart. Nothing else holding them now, so these will come apart with a bit of encouragement in whichever direction we choose to go. They're doweled together, so there's a fair bit of tension still holding them. The preferred approach for this is to choose an area which is solid. We're going to be knocking this with a mallet in a moment, so I don't want to go right on a corner here where we've got a through hole, so there's thin, weak material there. I want to pick a point where it's a solid slab of steel. And just give that a few taps, and you can see that that's loosened off. Now I can flip it over and do the same from the other side, or I can go into the sides with a pair of pry bars or screwdrivers. Yeah, this is tight. This is where it pays dividends to have a very big toolkit. So I'm going to put a blade in either side, try and get close to where the dowels are, because that's where the force needs to be exerted. And just gently work on that. What you don't want to do, obviously, is leave any marks, because at the very least they're going to add to the workload, because you're going to need to be polishing out marks for an extra hour. I can see that one dowel has released, the other one hasn't. It must be pretty close. Does not want to come out. Just one other thing, sometimes with these dowels, they're actually hollow dowel which is threaded. You can put a screw down into the thread and then pull on the screw with a slide hammer or whatever. These ones, so far as I can see, are not of that ilk. So we're going to have to try I can't believe one dowel is out and the other one There's still enough of it to hold the whole thing shut. But that is the situation in which we find ourselves. I feel that's so close. Dip back into the toolbox. Every time the gap gets bigger, you can get a bigger tool in the hole. There we go. So that's the end plate off. Finally. A couple of O-rings there that seal against the adapter plate. So those can come off. This is filthy, but doesn't look damaged. I think that'll clean up okay. We've got a bit of rust up here around the top. You tend to get the rust where the oil doesn't reach when the pump's switched off, so it tends to be across the top surfaces. That doesn't look too bad. I think we'll be alright with that. And then we've got a rotor and stator arrangement there. That's the inlet port. So that's turning around in that direction. And then we need to go through the same process with each stage, each section. Oh, there you go. That one came off really easily. You just never know, do you? So that's our oil pump in there, which should be coming out, but there's obviously a fair bit of oil tension there holding that. Then on the bottom of this section there's a filter. See, there's an oil strainer here which just filters the oil as it's picked up, so it comes up through this strainer and into the oil pump. And that strainer again is pretty filthy. If that blocks up completely, then obviously the pump stops picking up oil, or at least stops picking up sufficient oil, and you'll end up with bad oil starvation. So that needs to be replaced. Not sure why that doesn't want to come out. I'm loath to immediately start pounding on it. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to put it to one side, and I'm going to go and refer to the workshop manual on that, just to check that there's nothing else I'm missing there that's holding that. Incidentally, if you need schematic drawings for these pumps, which is really useful for dismantling and even more useful for reassembly, head to our website, LabVac.net. Along the top there you'll find a resources tab, and under the list of the drop down list from there you'll find schematics, and pretty much all of the pumps that I work on you'll find a schematic there that you can download for free, so that you've got an image to work to, which is always helpful. This spring and pad that I've just picked up is the gas ballast non-return that sits in between. So the spring sits down in there, and then the pad seals against here. Just stops oil going back up the gas ballast circuit when the pump's not using gas ballast. So that's where that's come from. And then maybe these sections will pry off nicely with the slots provided. Yeah, look at that. Just that first one that caused all the trouble. Stator, rotor and vane set here. We can pop those out. Very short vanes. Most pumps, the vanes are much longer front to back than that. And then that's the rotor just coming off the shaft there, which again has key with it. So in the interest that I'll level with you, the truth is I don't know when I'm going to put this pump back together again, but it's not going to be in the next few hours. So to help my poor brain to keep everything straight, I'm going to just sort of keep items together that need to end up together. You know what I mean? And then we can take, so with everything off there so that that can slide through, hopefully we'll be able to, there we go, separate those last parts. So the centre bearing plate comes off there, and then that lets the LabVac rotor out. Again, pair of vanes. That one is sprung where the other wasn't. And then that's our shaft and rotor section there. And this stator, a quick look there. That looks in nice condition. Got a clear duoseal through there. So we've got some surface nasties on this pump, but nothing that's going to stop it cleaning up and going back together. I'm going to have one last whack on that shaft seal just so that I can tell you exactly how that came out. But I'm going to take it off to a second bench that I use for hammering on things. And I'm delighted to report it didn't make any difference whatsoever. That's still well in there. It's destroyed the seal, which is not a problem because it's being replaced, but okay. The next option, what I'm going to try as an alternative is to feed a flat blade. Again, this is a D-sharpened screwdriver. Try and feed that between the seal and the backing. My fear is, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking the shaft seal, which is so hardened off, it actually might end up being tougher than the aluminium housing, which is going to leave me with a problem. Try and work it round from different angles. It's definitely moving now. You're probably only seeing the top of my hat at the moment, but trust me, the shaft seal is moving. There we go. There it is, out. Utterly destroyed, but out. Has left a few marks in there. Nothing that's going to cause us a problem. What I will do is just off camera, I'll go through that with a bit of wet and dry, possibly a round file, and just trim that so there's no nasty snags. But given the position that it's in, it shouldn't cause any issues. This is always the trouble. You get the odd seal that's thoroughly stuck in there because the pumps run too long between services, and then it can cause a whole heap of extra problems. So other than getting that rod out and just taking this mechanism off to aid the cleaning process, it's basically down to now thoroughly cleaning all the components, which I do off camera because it's going to take hours to sort this lot out. And then once that's done, I'll bring it back and we'll look at reassembling it. Hi, so we're back with this Varian Agilent DS202 pump. It's all been thoroughly clean. It's the next day now, time to put it all back together again, but there's a couple of things that I didn't cover earlier on taking apart. I did mention the oil pump here, and that I couldn't immediately see how to dismantle that. I lifted the outside cog, if you like, out of there with a pick. That came out pretty easily, and then I looked at how this is assembled. What I found is that there is a shaft, it's a dowel, which you can see just in the centre there. There's a interference fit dowel that holds this section on here to the centre cog in there. I can't shift that, couldn't get that out. It would be possible to put a drift in there and drive it through. What concerns me is how thin the connecting pieces are on this side, and I wouldn't want to damage that because I don't have a replacement. What I also found was that it was perfectly possible there's sufficient play in there to clean it very thoroughly. So I cleaned that all through and then I've re-oiled it, and I don't see any problem with that. So I'm going to leave that well alone. But that's what you would need to do. You would need to drift that shaft out if you had a pump that was really in a condition where that needed to come apart, but this one's pretty clean. The other couple of things that I didn't do in the strip down, although I believe that I did mention there's a restrictor for the gas ballast which just unscrews from there, so I took that out and I jetted it through with solvent to make sure that it was all clear, and then I'll just pinch that back down. And then I also, this control arm for the anti-suckback pad on the inlet, I looked into this in a little bit more detail, and this does really need to come out because there are a few O-rings in the assembly. So I think the best way to do that, this clip needs to be removed. So I've just eased that off there with a screwdriver, and then I can get some long nose pliers in there. So there is a small clip there that holds the end on. We need to not lose that because that isn't in the kit, which we'll get to in a moment. Then the right angle section can come off. Just need to ease the shaft back. So that's what fits onto the end there. And then this main shaft can be pulled through. And as you can see there's a couple of O-rings on there, extremely small, which will change. And then finally, the block that it sits through needs to be removed. Which we can just unthread from there. And then underneath there again, there's an O-ring that we're going to replace. So those were the parts there that I didn't mention in the strip down, tear down, whatever you like to call it. So we've got those to put back together as well. So as I say, everything's been thoroughly cleaned. I can't stress enough how important it is that all these surfaces are cleaned, all the throughways, all the valve seats, everything needs to come back shiny before you reassemble. Because if there's any material left in there, even if it appears to be firmly stuck to the surfaces, when you run the pump and it's under vacuum, they're all going to outgas and they're going to spoil the vacuum performance of the pump. So cleaning is critical. I don't show it in the videos because frankly it takes hours, and these videos are long enough already. So where to begin? I think we'll begin with the parts that we've already got here. So let's take a look at the kit, which is pretty comprehensive in this instance. So I've got a replacement gasket, a felt pad, and then I've got a couple of bags of components. So I've got a replacement for that strainer that I talked about being easily blocked, so we've got a new one there. I've got the inlet pad for the non-return, got some flat rubber washers which are for sealing on the oil box. Got a new outer shaft seal. I've got my 3 replacement valves, so a pad and a spring that just sit together like that. That will replace all of the old ones that came out of there. I've got a coupling rubber, or plastic really, that goes in there. This is the gas ballast non-return. Again, we've got a new one there, pad and spring. So the old one, which is sitting over there, we'll get rid of that. And then I've got this rather convoluted spring, which fairly obviously goes on the control rod there, and a new clip that holds it in place. And then I've got a fairly common pair of vane springs. And then to the bag of O-rings. I've got various O-rings here now. Again, as is perfectly normal and usual, I've got a kit here that covers a a whole range of pumps. So I think the 102, 202, 402, 872, whatever they are, they all come out of the same kit for inventory reasons. So there are going to be parts that we don't need because they fit into a larger pump or whatever. So we're going to figure those out as we go through. So I'm going to start here with the most obvious, because I've just disassembled this. I'm going to reassemble it. So I've got a new O-ring going in there. So I can just match that up to what I've got in the new bag. Make sure that that actually seats properly and is the right one. The other thing with you open a bag of O-rings and there's going to be a few in there that look extremely similar to each other. And the only way you're going to know is to test fit, but obviously test fit on the pump after it's been cleaned. You don't want to contaminate the new O-rings before you've even used them. So yes, I believe that's the right size. This one's very similar. Why don't we go through and just identify a few more, and then we might be able to put that aside. So I know I'm going to need some O-rings in here, because you always need O-rings on the adapter plate. So I'm going to test fit that one because that's the one that I'm slightly wary of. There we go, that's a good fit there. So we'll say that one goes there. So that one's correct. So I can screw that back into place. And I will just pinch that down. Don't put a lot of force on that, because you've got a steel part here threading into an aluminium thread. It's going to be very easy to damage that, and because it's O-ring sealed, it doesn't need a lot of pressure, it doesn't need a lot of torque put into it to seal that up. Same goes all the way through. So the next thing I need to look at then is this one here. So I've got a replacement clip and spring, so I might as well put those on. This is a conventional circlip. It might not be called a circlip everywhere, it's called a circlip here in my small world. So we'll get that off. That allows us to remove the spring. Frankly, as you can see, those parts I'm throwing away here are so clean and undamaged that they could just as easily be reused. But hey ho, we've got the parts, let's use them. So that fits onto there, and then the new circlip will go onto there. These can be tricky. Very tight to install, and very easy to have them ping off across the room on you. Right, let's clip that on. That's our spring ready to go. So the final thing on there is to change these two O-rings that seal it through the block. These O-rings are nice and soft still, to be honest. If they weren't replaced, I'm sure it wouldn't cause any issues with the operation of the pump. They don't want to come off with the pick, so I'm going to just cut them out. There's one. There's two. And then our replacements are going to be these. Although these look rather small for the job. So I may come to regret having cut those out. Yeah, that one's just broken. I'm trying to get it on. Right, so a little bit of a disaster there. Having cut the original O-rings out, the replacements in the kit were too small. And the first one broke. What I've had to do is go into my stock of O-rings and find a replacement that does fit. Which fortunately I had. All I can say is if the O-rings that are already on there are still soft and move around nicely, probably best to leave them alone. It's always going to be something of an issue with identifying parts until you've removed the old. You can't really compare it to the new very easily. So unless the kit clearly identifies the sizes, it's difficult to do. Fortunately, I got out of trouble there because I keep a big stock of other parts. You may not be so lucky. This is why I say keep the old parts until you've really checked that the new ones are suitable replacements, and try to avoid cutting them if you can. So there we go. We've now got that reassembled. I'm going to apply a little bit of oil so that those O-rings will slide through. That's not even the difficult bit yet. So that then fits back through here. Give it a bit of a twist as the O-rings go in. And that should go all the way up to the clip there. And then we get to what I think is going to be the tricky part, which is reattaching this and getting the clip back through it. So going to need to move the shaft. Hopefully you're getting a clear picture of that. We've got to line up the hole in the shaft with the hole in here. There we go. So just push that back on, then we've got to get this clip to go through both those holes simultaneously. The clip's going to fit round to the outside of that. So I'm just going to try to grab the components then, get hold of that to hold it a little bit steady. Hopefully I can find the corresponding hole in the main shaft. Okay. Attempt number 2. Let's just see exactly where that hole in the shaft is. So if I get that to be straight up, there we go, I can see it now. Drop that down inside. Didn't I say I thought this would be the tricky part? sure it's very difficult for you to see what I'm actually doing at the moment, but I don't have much of an option but to get my face right up close. There we go. Just felt that go in, and then push that clip. There we go, that's back in place. And that moves up and down as it did before I started all of that. So fingers crossed I got all of that back together right, hey? Don't really want to have to do that again. Okay, where do we go next? Tradition dictates that we kind of put the cartridge together. So we've got the various sections and stages there, which I've lined up in order. And we can start to build that back together. So this is our rotor, which is going to sit through there. We've got no shaft seals in this pump in terms of the cartridge itself, so it should go together fairly easily. So we can start now to reassemble the main cartridge. I've had a little play around with this, and I think I've figured out what I think is the most straightforward way to assemble it. That's not to say that it's the only way to do it. If someone's got a better sequence to assemble parts, then I'd love to know. Don't think this is the most straightforward of pumps to assemble, actually. So I'm going to start with the small rotor and the centre bearing plate, and I'm going to lock those two together. Then I'm going to bring in the shaft for that section and assemble that next. So that will feed through from this side. I'm making sure, obviously, that everything is properly lubricated as it goes together. Then I'm going to bring in the key that holds that rotor, drop that into the slot, so that's sitting here, and then the rotor piece itself can slide onto there, and then vanes will drop in. These vanes are not orientated, so they can go in either vane either side and either way up, and those are there. And now we have to get the end plate assembled. Now the two flanges on the shaft here have to actually slot in around the key on the end of the shaft here, so I'm going to give that a twist, give them what looks like the right angle. It's very difficult to see in there, and then you've also got the two dowels on there which you've got to go into. And I think that that's probably the easiest way to do that. And then it means that we've got a kind of flat surface if I tip the pump over to be able to carry on from there. So then we can put the large vanes into the LabVac stage. Just assemble those with the new springs. Plenty of oil. Slot those home into the rotor. Just make sure they're moving nicely and that the whole thing is rotating. It's difficult to do without the coupling on there, but yes, it is. So with plenty of oil on there, go ahead and fit the Fit the stator. Just need to give those vanes a squeeze underneath there so that they'll fit through, and then that should drop on and line up with the dowels. At that point we've got most of the assembly there. I've just got the end plate. Now I did find during cleaning and that little bit of test fitting that I did, there is a hot spot on the shaft here. It's not visible, but I could feel it, and it was causing the end plate to have a bit of trouble seating home. So I gave that a very good polish, and hopefully it will be good to go on. I can feel just there, there's just a little spot where it's a bit tight, but there it is, home. And that's the main cartridge assembled. What I do want to do at this stage, put the coupling on, just give that a turn by hand for feel, put it back on end. So I need to just put the key in there, drop the shaft coupler into place, and then I can turn that. Now you always want to turn it in the direction that the pump operates. So the inlet is on this side here, the valves, which are the outlet, are over here, so the rotation is in that direction. It's not always the same for every pump, it varies, but that is turning smoothly. I'm happy to carry on. So you do need to take the key back out of there, because when it eventually will go through the outer shaft seal, we don't want the key in the way, catching on the seal. Okay, so a little bit of shuffle around. Cartridge is complete. We now need to attach cartridge to adapter plate. Now, one part that still needs to go into this inlet is the piston and pad that go together there. Now I want to get this assembled as much as possible in advance of attaching the cartridge, because what occurs to me is that while I've got lots of movement on this arrangement at the moment, once the cartridge is in there, I'm going to be restricted in what I can move around. And if, for example, I haven't put this piston in, maybe I won't be able to get access to do that once it's a larger block of metal. So we'll get the inlet valve piston. If you turn this out of the way, and that'll drop in, and then that guide pin has to go in with it. So that now moves up and down with that. It pops out fairly easily, so we'll keep an eye on that. And then that pad is going to sit in on top of that. Like that. And I'm going to arrange the rest of the components on top of here. I might come to regret that, but I don't think that's necessary. I've got movement on that, and provided I don't shove it around too much, I don't think that's going to come loose. So the next thing then, I've already installed the outer shaft seal into here. I did that off camera because I have to do it on a different bench and you wouldn't have been able to see it anyway. So to fit that shaft seal, what I use is this very basic driver set, which you can buy from eBay or wherever. Select the right size for the shaft seal that you've got, and then that just sits behind it. Give it a whack with a hammer. Do it gently and persuade it in rather than hammering it, because if they go lopsided you can end up damaging the seal. If you drive it in straight to begin with, they go in pretty easily. So you haven't missed much by not seeing me do that. So that's in place. ready to receive the cartridge. My inlet valve is assembled and operating as it should for the time being. I've got an O-ring here that I dropped in at the beginning when we were sizing things, and there's a second one which is going to sit around here to seal the inlet. And then I've got the 4 rods that hold the assembly. They can go in afterwards, they can go in before. I think what we'll do is we'll put the 2 parts together and then we'll run the rods through. Some pumps you have to put the rods in first. On this one, I'm looking at it and I'm seeing that this is doweled. These 2 surfaces are doweled together. I've got a dowel here. So I've got my O-rings in place and the shaft seal is there. One more part that has to go in before these 2 are assembled together, and that is this piston which operates the inlet valve mechanism. Now that has to sit in there, and if that's not put in first, then when you assemble these 2 together, this will be in the way and you won't be able to install that, and it'll have to come apart again. Ask me how I know. So from there, leave that spring out of the way. The crucial thing here is to look after the shaft seal, so I'm going to get right down so I can see it, and I'm going to lower the cartridge on, making sure that that goes straight through. Now the dowels have picked up, so I know the orientation is good here. I know that my inlet valve is going to operate when the oil pushes up on the piston. It will allow the inlet valve to open. So I can now go ahead and install the 2 firmly together by dropping through the threaded rods, screwing those into place. And I want to make sure that obviously I've got enough remaining for the nuts to sit on, but I don't really want more than that coming through, because that would mean that I've got less thread actually going into the adapter to hold. And it could also mean, if there's too much rod showing on this end of the pump, that it'll foul on the oil box when we come to put that on. I'm just going to wind those in. They might not all be exactly the same length, they're just cut lengths of rod, so there may be some variance. And once I'm content with the position of those, I'll put the original washers back on. And wind the nuts on. And then we're starting to get to a point where it looks like a pump again. Get those down, and then I'm just going to nip all 4 of them up. I'm only nipping them up at the moment, these are not tight. As you tighten these, obviously it'll compress the sections of the cartridge together. If you wind them up too tight, then the cartridge will lock up and you won't be able to turn it, the motor won't be able to turn it. So you need to get it to just the right amount of tight. There's no torque spec for these, it's just done by hand. So we can get a feel for it by reinstalling the key and the coupling, and then turning the pump by hand. So there we go, we've got everything in. Just double check that's all good. So the spring can come round. The spring, the long end of the spring sits out there, the other end is going to clip up here over. So now that will open when there's no oil pressure, or rather when there is oil pressure. It'll lift the rod up and the spring will, I'll just allow that to come down. As soon as the pump stops running, oil pressure drops, then this spring will snap that shut again. So that's working correctly. So to get the correct tension on here, it's very much a feel thing, as I say. So at the moment, pump is turning freely, no problems there, so we can nip it up a bit more. We don't want to get to a point where the pump stops turning altogether or becomes very stiff to turn. We want to get all four of them to roughly the same tension. So I'll just do them up a bit, turn it, and I can hear the pump mechanism rotating, and obviously there's assembly oil in there, so you can hear the oil moving around. These feel like they're pretty tight now. You can hear the pump mechanism doing its work now. If it's not making any sound, then you haven't got enough tension. If it's difficult to turn, you've got too much. So it's somewhere in there, and it is a bit of an experience thing. So there we go, we've got sufficient there. We'll check it again once the rest of the cartridge is assembled. So the next thing to go into here, we can either go to close off the end plate, or we can attach to the top. I think the wisest thing to do at this stage is to close up the oil pump, because eventually we're going to put this big cover on, which is going to block our access to anything else. So the oil pump is here. We're going to get some fresh oil into it. Not a lot, just enough that we know it's lubricated. My apologies, another interruption. Sounds gear can sit into busy there. Day here today. Right, so that's in place. We can put the cover on with these very delicate button head screws. And you do sometimes find that where you've got very delicate hardware like this, and it's not just the design engineers messing with you. The intention is to prevent you from wellying down on these screws. Obviously, if you put too much torque onto these screws, the heads are going to give out. So it indicates that we don't need a lot of force on here. So that's our oil pump back together. Once again, go back and check. Yep, we've got nice smooth motion there. Check this is still working. A little bit paranoid about that mechanism. It looks over elaborate for what it does. Now we can get some valves back onto this. So we've got this plate which sits over the top of them. I don't remember the orientation that this came off, but it looks to me that it's pokey-okey, so it can only go on in one direction. So we get our new valves and springs put into position. Make sure they've all sat down properly, and then those studs will line up with the top of the springs, and if the holes line up, then we should be good, which we are. Now, this contraption, which then sits over the top of that, one of the screws on here, this one at this end, actually goes through that bar and holds it into place. So we will need to get that aligned as well. The old springs still in this pot, we'll get rid of those. And we've got various bits of hardware still left over, and all of those screws are the same, so we'll just grab one and persevere. The 3mm Allen key, so I'm just going to compress the springs there, hold that down, get the first screw into place, double check that everything is in where it should be, and then the big cover can slide on over the top, and we've got one screw which picks up the hole there, slightly out of alignment. Bring that across. So that's our exhaust valve seated underneath there. We've got one more screw which holds the cover at this end onto that bar. There we go, but there's one more part still to go in, and that's our fine filter, this fine mesh filter for the oil pickup, which sits up underneath there and then is clamped in place from underneath. We'll get that in there. The clamp needs to be the other way up. It's an extremely fine piece of steel, this clamp. So I'm sure it could be bent to fit if it doesn't want to do it for itself, but it just seems to bend whichever way it wants to go. Okay. That's in there. So at this point, that's the major components of the pump back together again. So we can now go about putting the oil box back together and getting that onto the pump. So a few things here that we took off. One was the exhaust valve, which has got a sort of silencer built into it. And there's also the fill port for putting the oil in, so there's a new rubber gasket on there. the drain plug here, which again has one of these flat gaskets on it. This actually has a magnet in the centre of it there, like you might find on a car engine sump. Basically to catch any bits of metal that go through the pump or fall out of the pump or otherwise end up down there. So we'll get that in. Don't need a huge lot of force on anything that's rubber sealed. Drain plugs included. It's fairly rare that they leak. Oil pump leaks normally come from shaft seals rather than these ports. That O-ring is slightly short. I'm just going to give it a gentle stretch. There we go, that's into place. And the sight glass, which cleaned up fairly well. They're never perfect, but it's fairly good. And then the cover for it, which is marked minimum and maximum on there. So we'll drop that into place. And then there are 4 little screws to clamp that down. Just going to go round those, particularly because there is a glass piece in there. We're not going to clamp down hard on one corner and then have that corner chip or shatter when the other screws are tight. And so and again we've got that big O-ring with lots of give in it that's forming the seal there, so not a lot going on there pressure wise either. That's our oil box reassembled. Outside of the pump's still a bit mucky. Once it's working and it's proved itself, and we give that a good going over and get it clean, ready for the customer to have back. Then that's going to attach into there. This is one of the pumps. They vary. Sometimes you would seat the oil box that way, but the screws on this are actually coming from the reverse, so we need to drop the pump into the oil box. So we'll grab our new gasket for it. Set that on there. And then the whole assembly can drop through that. We'll just get everything lined up and then find the hardware to reattach it. 4 very long bolts go through there. Just need to be cautious as this goes to make sure that they're actually lining up through the holes in the cork gasket. Cork's obviously a pretty soft material. If you push hard enough, you can make your own hole in it with a screw that size. And I'm just going to make sure that those are all threading in again before tightening anything down. Just make sure everything's aligned. These should be screwing in as they are, very easily with fingers. I'm not having to grab this to force the screws down, so I know they're going in properly. And then we can just tighten those again, working round to evenly distribute the force down onto that cork gasket and make the seal. don't see cork gaskets on modern pumps very often now. The majority of them have gone over to printed gaskets, which I think are probably cheaper to produce, possibly more environmentally friendly. So there we go, pump's back in the oil box, still turns, making the right noises. We can now lock this back into place. There's a pinch screw round there. That was a 4mm required for that, if I remember rightly. The general rule in terms of positioning, this can slide up and down on the shaft. The general rule, and I say a general rule, is that the face of the coupling should be flush with the face of the shaft, and that should put it in the right position. It's not always the case. Some pumps the shaft will protrude through, so it's a case of kind of looking at it as you take it apart and putting it back in the same manner. There we go, and then the coupling rubber will go into there, and then we can complete the inlet, which now that everything is together, that's popping up and down as it should. So the inlet port will go over the top of that, and we have a strainer which goes with it, but that actually sits in from the outside. Okay, so that may well fall out, which it does, so we'll leave that to one side for the moment. And then that sits in there, the O-ring's going to seal there, and then that pad is coming up underneath to close the inlet. Then we have our gas ballast knob, which just screws straight back into there. This one, I took it apart, it didn't have a seal on it. I kind of think it should do when it's closed. I think that should be sealed. So should that be sealed with an O-ring, or should that be sealed with the flat gasket? Given the way that sits in the recess, I'd say we go with the O-ring. Like I said in this or one of the other many videos, if you do need any schematics such as this, which seems to confirm that yes, it's the O-ring. If you need those, head to our website. It's labvac.net, and then along the top bar you'll find the resources tab, and within the resources section you'll find a lot of those schematics, certainly for this pump, and for most of the other ones that you'll come across. Schematics will be there, you can download those for free, and they'll just help you with a little bit of extra info on how everything should fit together for your pump. So we've got the multitude of screws to go in here. So get a couple over that side, so that's properly orientated. Same onto here. And that's the inlet clamped back into place. Close that gas ballast down onto that new O-ring. And then we're ready to attach the motor. Not forgetting the handle that sits in there. Love these loose plastic handles. Loads of the manufacturers like to put these loose plastic handles on there just to check who's got enough fingers to hold everything together while they lower the motor into place, which is of course very heavy. What I like to do is I'll just turn the pump again, just so I know where the orientation is there. So I've got a gap at the top, so I can then rotate the motor coupling side to get that so it will align, and then hopefully that will drop into place as I lower it on. The handle's obviously going to fall out, so a couple of fingers to hold that. Then I'll lose all my fingers as it goes together. There we go. And that has gone. That's good. So the motor's into place. We can get the bolts into that. Two long ones at the bottom. The shorter one in that tricky position up there. Get that going by hand. Just to try and avoid having to spend too long working on it. The Allen key. Tap those down. And then I really think this is a case where the pump manufacturer could have worked a little bit harder on the drawings with the motor manufacturer. The motors are always bought in, ready assembled to bolt on. All manufacturers do that. But a bit of communication there, guys, might have helped. And we do the base plate, which will sit up underneath there. General rule in terms of orienting these is a lot of base plates on pumps have a curved surface here that follows the curve of the motor. So we know that's going to go up this way round. Get it into position. It's always a good idea, should have mentioned it earlier, just start all the screws by hand. They're generally stainless steel screws, and as is the case with this, it's a stainless steel screw going into an aluminium part. So the thread on the alley part, which is the expensive bit, is what's going to fail first if you cross thread anything. So fingers first, just to make sure everything's going in smoothly. If it's not, stop, come back out and go in and clean whatever's stopping it from threading in. Then we can pop that back down, not forgetting to put the strainer in there now that the pump is hopefully staying the right way up. And then we've got these side flashes. Will go into place. This was again my tiny 2.5mm Allen key. And the pump is pretty much now back together. I won't lie, I haven't particularly enjoyed this one. It's quite a finicky design. There's a lot of elements in there that have to be assembled in the correct order, otherwise you find yourself taking things apart again. There's a few choices of materials here and there that seem a little less robust than some other pumps. But that said, there's a lot of these out there, they've got to be doing something right. So there's our Varian DS202 from Agilent Technologies, all put back together again. This will go over to the test bench now, get some fresh oil in it and get it running for a few hours and check that final vacuum. So I'll take something on the end that shows you that. So there's our Agilent Varian DS202 vacuum pump back together on the test bench, pulling 1 × 10⁻³ millibar, which is the limit of the gauge, so that's a good figure to see. If we can do anything for you in terms of advice or spare parts or sending pumps in to us for servicing, do get in touch through labvac.net. Thank you.